I certainly can't promise a musical interlude. That's not really my style, I think. But let's begin with music anyway, and then get to the other stuff. No, it's not a concert. So there we have, this is the music for today. That's quite an old piece by my standards. It's 5 years old. It's brand new music, new notation, new notes, extra pitches in the gaps between the notes, huge amounts of information in a very short space of time. It's about 6,000 notes in about a minute and a half of music. Each note requires 2 or 3 independent movements to produce it, 6 octaves of the audible sound spectrum, and bowing techniques requiring the performer to match the speed of the bow thrown, that's when it bounces naturally, with an exact controlled equivalent, which is actually produced by setting up an interference between 2 different muscle tensions in the muscle. There are irrational divisions of the meter in 5 and 7 and 9, all the stuff an audience really doesn't need to know. You do not need to know about that. Forget it. What you do need to think about is this brand new music was written to be played using a machine, and a violin is a machine, was not only made 400 years ago, but can be used consistently without stopping for 400 years. I've played a violin made in 1550, nearly half a millennium. The violin is a challenge to all of us, not just people like me who have been sad enough to have been glued to it for hours of every single day of our sentient life. It's a rare example of mechanical longevity, of the permanent upgrade, of the long now. This beautiful instrument was made in a small city in northern Italy, Cremona, at the beginning of the 17th century. It's just so simple. It's a box of maple and spruce. It's got silver-covered animal intestines for the strings, pegs of rosewood, fingerboard of hardwood, just 84 bits of wood stuck together. It's designed to play, in its time, very simple music that sounded something like this. Actually, I lied. When Henry Purcell wrote that, this violin was already 80 years old. So, effectively finished. But somehow this instrument, the Fidel as it began, which was originally the instrument of the pub, of the brothel, it took hold of our imaginations, of serious music, and the environments it was designed for, but also the imaginations of generations to come. Now, for a number of reasons, this thing seems to have thrived on history. Now, bearing in mind we're dealing with an object which, let's quote Indiana Jones, that belongs in the museum. Now, not a short walk from here is another violin, a bit older than this one, made in the city of Brescia by Gasparo da Salo. In the 19th century, this became world famous in the hands of someone who's called the flaxen-haired Paganini, Ola Bull, your great national patriot, one of the people who's responsible for the very idea of being Norwegian. However, what's happened to that violin? It's in a case designed for it the year after Bull died by his American widow, and on the case it says, not to be played. And since 1881, it hasn't been. Its voice has faltered, development has stopped, and an object which was designed to thrive on human contact, and it really, really does, it's taken from it. It's become Indiana Jones's museum piece, and this incredible symbiosis between machine and user, which liberates both of us. The vibration is almost but stopped. And the most important element, a word I love, the element of touch, that's the word I want to give you all, haptic, has been removed. Touch is so incredibly important to all of us. So here's my slightly central point, and I'd like to play with it using a sidebar. Around about the same time the violin was invented, scientists, particularly in Italy, were getting very, very excited about what used to be called lodestones. We're going to call them magnets. No one could really work out what you could do with a magnet except use it to point to north, and a lot of people didn't want to use it to do that. Some people thought you could do it to find latitude using the amount that the lodestone, the magnet would decline, but that failed. So no one could work out what to do with it, except the church hated it. Something about the magnet was heretical, and the Italian Inquisition got their teeth into it and declared it anathema. So the magnet was a wondrous and rare thing, and most people on the planet would never meet one. The average person on the planet today, including all the people who have no access whatsoever to computer technology, all that huge number of people who don't have internet connections, the average person owns 50 magnets. I would warrant there's probably a few hundred, a thousand of them in this room today. We depend on magnets and electromagnets. It's a bit of technology which only found its use much later on. And the violin family is a bit like that. It's to do with art. The only unifying definition of art is it is inherently useless. That's the great thing about it. No one could tell us what its practical application is. It can't be put in a box. I'm probably the only person in this room who doesn't have a degree, and I have no interest in getting one, because I knew this is what I wanted to do. So I'm useless. I can't do anything, right? But somehow, people find me things to do. Since this thing was invented 450 years ago, it's not been found necessary to change the acoustic or design specifications of it more than a small amount, tiny things you need to worry about. And this violin here was made by the grandsons of the man who invented the violin, Andrea Amati. As the violin gets older, its material stabilizes the internal moisture of the wood itself, and the trees that this violin was made from, because they come from old houses in Italy, were probably cut down sometime in the 1200s. The wood becomes more stable, which means it's not subject to meteorological vagaries. It doesn't care about the weather. The older an instrument is, the less it cares about what's around it. A few years ago, I was giving a concert on what is possibly the most famous violin in the world. That's a violin which was owned by Niccolo Paganini. If you aren't violinists, you'll recognize this tune. That's Paganini, who was the great inventor of virtuosity. His Guarnerius del Gesù is the treasured possession of the city of Genoa, and it sits behind armored glass in a room near the town hall. When the museum is open, there is always a policeman in full uniform sitting next to the violin. I'm very lucky. I've played this violin 5 times, both in Italy and in the UK. However, a few years ago, when I was working in Genova, the University of Florence asked me if I'd do an experiment with them. And this experiment really, really upset me. They said, we'd like, while you play this instrument, to insert a sensor into the violin to work out what the relationship is between its internal humidity and you. Boring. Anyway, so went on stage, and backstage, I'm not really a techie kind of person. I don't have a mobile phone. Never had one. So backstage suddenly was full of computer equipment. What this meant was, while I played, they were able to take real-time readings wirelessly of the internal temperature and humidity inside the violin. As I came out on stage, it was a hot autumn evening. There were about the same number of people in the room as this, except it was Italy, so it was really sticky and really hot. The humidity inside the instrument went straight up instantly to about 90% plus. But as I started to play, and it got close to me, the biggest organ of my body, of your body, the epidermis, started to do its work. The only reason that your skin doesn't dry out and fall off or melt is because it constantly regulates it's a constant humidifier, regulates the humidity of itself. Within 5 minutes of me starting to play, the instrument, by being close to me, had gone from being 95% humidity inside to a nice stable 60 to 75%. This means that the best thing possible, I want to say this to all the museum keepers out there, the absolute best thing for a violin, however old, is to be close to me, actually. So the element of touch is reciprocal. Now, Now, one grail, it seems to me, of much of our obsession with design and innovation is how do we come up with objects, functional or not, which are not only pleasing to the ear and the eye, but also constantly absorbing to hold and to touch. Because here's another problem. I'm biased, of course, because I love violins, but I'd like you to think about something, and I want you to think about it in the context of how you feel about the objects which you use each day. Next time you see a player with an instrument, look what they're doing with it. Male or female, invariably, they will have a very, very physicalized relationship with this wooden box. Now, when it's in use, of course, the touch is limited. I'm only allowed to touch it here and here. That's it, 2 places, collarbone, there, and my hand. Now, but if you watch a violinist at rest, particularly when the player is sitting down, well, effectively the instrument is not doing anything, not producing any music. You might argue it's unnecessary. That's when the kind of design genius steps in. And you'll notice that players will be sitting there holding an instrument like this. There is nothing more fascinating and alluring to hold than a violin. Now, you might argue, well, why is this? It's a bevy of odd edges and curves, and there's no way of holding it. But having held one of these every day of my life since I was 4, I can tell you that the fascination with holding it never finishes. So if somehow, whether this was accident or design or the genius of true folk art, which perfects itself through use, reiteration, and adjustment, we have an object here which any of designers of any tech today would love, which the owner can't stop touching and feeling like this. You'll always see players doing it. The left cheek is it's a wonderful place to hold it. Now, I want to put this into another context. I spend hours and hours and hours each year with living composers. They love to get close to the violin for other reasons, to get close to hear the sounds they can imagine related to the sounds which are coming from it, and sometimes to touch it. 3 days ago, yesterday, not 3 days ago, I received this by email. Now, that was written day before yesterday by an Australian composer living in the west of England. Now, the touch thing is very important, and I'd like to get to some of the network ideas which have been played today. It's called Scheherazade, and Scheherazade, many of you will know, is the storytelling genius of Arab folk tales from the Arabian Nights. It's named for my wife, who's a writer. And what had happened was 10 years ago, I introduced the composer, Sadie Harrison. The other piece I played was by a composer called David Gorton. I introduced Sadie to my wife. 2 weeks ago, they discovered they wanted to work together. And so in the past week, suddenly, the introduction has flowered into something which has gone beyond me. They're going to write an opera together. This tiny little piece is a present to me to get me out of the way, is the first manifestation of that. And that's one thing I wanted to bring to the table, which is you might get to know somebody, but you never quite know, just like a piece of technology, you never quite know when that's going to flower into something. Now, back to that idea of the object. There's another word I'd like to give you, quiddity. Quiddity. Quiddity is one of the most important qualities for humans. It means thingness. Thingness, the way we relate to objects, is one of the ways we define ourselves. going back to composers, over the years, I've been very lucky. I started working with composers when I was in my late teens, and the very first composer I worked with was Olivier Messiaen, and then I started working with Hans Werner Henze, who died quite recently. But I love working with composers of every generation, people much younger than me, thank goodness. And not once, simply not once, have I ever encountered a composer who was disappointed by the limitations of this 80 vibrating pieces of wood made 400 years ago with no straight lines. And I've witnessed it again and again, exceeding my expectations and the imaginations and expectations of composers from all over the world. And for me, that is an amazing, no small challenge for us today. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you.